demonstrating peyote for you today. We have a video that demonstrates peyote, but I wanted to do a little bit more in-depth, start to finish, use some easily identifiable materials, easy to see materials, and go over a little bit of different ways to actually end your peyote piece. Once you learn simple peyote, you can get into more complicated peyote, like doing designs. You can then get into doing things like tubular peyote and designs in that, as well as incorporating different sizes and styles of beads into your peyote stitch. Peyote stitch is also going to be used for bezeling and for the building blocks for many, many different projects. Once you learn the peyote stitch, you can kind of go free and learn a whole bunch of new different things from there. We're going to be starting today with the very, very basics of peyote. I'm going to be doing only even count peyote in this video. Odd count peyote is another video, and I'll probably do another in-depth odd count peyote video. They are two very different things, and I think it's nice to learn the even count before and master the even count before you get into the odd count. If you need any materials to do the peyote stitch, you can look back at the beginning of the video to the publish date that says when the video was actually produced. Underneath that, there's a little down arrow that says show more, and we'll put links to some of the essential supplies there. To start out and to learn peyote stitch, if you've never done anything before, you will need 2 colors of beads. I suggest 2 colors that are drastically different of 11-0 seed beads. I'm going to be using 2 Miyuki brand Duracoat. I have the dark orchid and the Spanish olive, and I'll be working with those, forming a line pattern, which is going to make it very easy to identify and know what beads to add and how to continue with the peyote stitch. In addition to the 2 beads, I'll be showing how to clasp the actual peyote stitch onto one of these bar slide clasps. In addition to the bar slide clasp, I'll also be explaining how to use a Miyuki push clasp, as well as a button or how you would attach to another closure. So you want your closure handy and your 2 tubes of seed beads. You obviously also need some thread and needle. To make it very, very easy to view, I'll be using the black thread in the .008 Wildfire thread. For most of my projects, I use the .006 Wildfire, and I tend to use white, green, and gray most often. The reason I'll be using black is so that you can exactly see the thread lines and what it should look like as we proceed to learn this peyote stitch. As far as needles go, I prefer the Pony brand needles, and once I open up the needle, I put them into usually one of my old seed bead cases. We're going to be starting with size 10 needle. The size 10 needle then will go on to your beading thread. It's nice to have a nice workable surface. That way you have a nice clean area to start and finish your project. You may also want to invest in a thread zap or a thread burner. This is going to help to burn down the thread wherever you make your connections if you have to add thread. It's also going to cauterize and to kind of ball up the end of the thread at the very, very end where you're adding your clasp, so that way the knot that you create will not come apart. In addition to that, I always usually have a pliers handy, just a regular standard bent nose pliers handy to flatten out the end of my thread, which is going to make it much easier to thread my needle. Like I said, we'll be doing even count peyote, and I'll be showing you how to start the peyote, how to add a clasp, and also my easy technique for adding thread. This is going to be a simple peyote, which is going to show up as lines. If you want to get into more pattern peyote, then you can check out some of my other YouTube videos for the chevron peyote, as well as the crystal V bracelet, which shows this exact pattern using different beads and different size beads to get a more raised and 3-dimensional look. So to get started with our basic peyote and learning the fundamentals of it, you're going to want 2 piles of your seed beads, one on either side of your bead mat. Also about 5 feet of your beading thread onto your needle. Also, it's good to have handy 1 bead that is not included in your project that will add as a stop bead. So to get started, get your piles of seed bead ready, your stop bead, and your thread and needle ready to go. So to get started, the first thing that I did is put my 5 feet of beading thread on my needle and added a stop bead. Again, the stop bead is going to come off the project, so I always make sure to use a bead that is not part of the project when you're using the stop bead. I have approximately 10 inches after the stop bead in order to connect to my clasp as I finish the project. The stop bead is just a bead that goes on twice, stops at that 10 inches, and I sew through the bead 2 times away from that 10-inch tail. The thread is going to be on the outside then of that bead, and I can easily pull the thread if I need to, if it doesn't slip off. The stop bead will also be a reference as far as which direction I'm sewing towards the stop bead. The needle will be going towards the stop bead or away from the stop bead. To begin again, we are going to start out by just doing a simple peyote strip. The peyote strip is going to be 6 wide. When you start peyote, the width of the beads is going to be picked up initially. So I'm going to be picking up 6 beads to get this width. Again, there is even count peyote and there is odd count peyote. I'm going to be focusing on even count peyote to teach you today. To start, we are going to pick up the 6 beads in an A-B pattern, A-B, A-B. When you begin peyote, you're actually beginning with the first 2 rows on the needle at the same time. As we progress then, we'll only be adding every other bead, meaning 3 beads per row. To begin, once you have that stop bead on, we're going to pick up that A-B pattern, 1A, 1B. And we're going to do it 3 times. Once you have those 3 beads on in that A-B pattern, you're going to let them drop down next to the stop bead. I'm going to push the beads towards the stop bead and try to get them to stay in that location. The next bead I put on is going to be the 7th bead. The 7th bead is going to be another olive colored bead, and it's going to sit right over top of the 6th bead. As I sew back towards the stop bead, I'm going to be sewing through all of my orchid beads, and I'll be adding 3 new olive beads. The first olive bead goes on, and then I'm going to skip over the olive bead already there in the 6th position and sew through the 5th bead, which is going to be that last orchid bead. Pulling the thread and needle tight then, I'm going to force those beads to sit right on top of one another. It's going to start looking a little bit like a brick wall. Again, I'm going to add another olive color, skip the olive below it, and sew through the orchid. This is going to get repeated 3 times. Again, I'm coming out over the olive, so I know I add an olive, and I sew through the orchid color. Make sure that you come out after the orchid color and do not sew into your stop bead. Give a nice tight pull at the end of each row, and make sure that you're building away from the stop bead now and progressing away. You can see the thread, and that's why I use the black thread, because you can see the thread that you're going to have 2 pieces right now going through the orchid beads. As we continue, every bead will have 2 pieces of thread going through it. Also on the side, you'll notice a bridge thread or a thread that connects right along the side. This is going to go the whole length of the project on both sides. That was just our 3rd row that we added, and we established after adding the first 2 rows in order. As we pull, we establish that 1st row, the 2nd row, and then we just added the 3rd row. As I come back the project and sew away from the stop bead, I'll be adding in 3 beads, this time in the orchid color. I'm adding the beads that sit, the color that sits on top of itself, and I also know that I'm adding the opposite color that I'm sewing into. I add an orchid and I sew into an olive. Add an orchid, sew into the next olive bead. Again, when you're adding them and sewing into these beads, you're always going to be adding the opposite color. Also, each row, as I complete row 4 here, you're always adding 3 beads. Coming out the end then of each row, give a nice little tight yank so you minimize the amount of thread that is shown. After having these 3 orchid beads on, we're going to come back towards the stop bead and add the olive color. Again, whatever bead is sticking up is the bead that you're going to sew into after adding 1 bead of the alternate color. As you sew back towards that stop bead, adding the first of the olive color bead, you'll notice again that thread bridge gapping from the previous row of that same color. I'm going to continue now, adding my last 2 olive beads, sewing through towards the stop bead, adding 1 at a time, and then sewing through the alternate color. As you sew towards the stop bead, you'll always be adding the olive color. As you sew away from the stop bead, you'll always be adding the orchid color. Always on the end, you're going to have that bridge thread, pick up the color that your thread is coming out of, and turn around and start going the opposite direction. This will continue the whole length of the peyote strip. As you continue to add your beads in those groups of 3, you may notice again that the little peyote strip starts to get a little bit what I call wonky or a little bit off. That it may go a little bit towards the right, it may go a little bit towards the left. A way to relieve that is going to be to make sure that your thread is pulled tight as you end each row. The tighter your thread is pulled, the more that you will not have any gaps and you won't have the peyote turn one way or another. If you do notice that the peyote is going to one way rather than the other and having a little bit of a kind of a snaking zigzag effect, just make sure to relax it a little bit, kind of push the beads around, and it will relax out unless there is a drastic difference in the tension that you're pulling. Another suggestion to help you as you create and you learn peyote stitch is I always prefer to sew away from me. What that means is that I prefer, as I'm picking up beads, to sew like I'm doing now, away from myself and towards the exterior area. When I get done an end of a row, I've had it for you guys that I've been beading towards myself. That's just so you can keep track of what we're doing. Normally in my hand, as I'm working, I take the project and I will flip the project so that way, again, I am beading away from me. That's going to mean that every other stitch, that stop bead is going to go top to bottom and flip as I work on it. I find this the easiest because, again, I'm faster and more comfortable with threading and sewing when I thread and sew away from me. So I tend to flip the project at the end of each row, so that way I'm always stitching away from me. Also, when you're stitching away from yourself or towards yourself, a lot of times the tension changes. Again, I do a nice tight pull, I'll flip the project in my hand, and now I'm ready to stitch away from me again. We're going to continue stitching this project the whole length of your wrist. Again, the clasp that I'm going to choose to use is this slider clasp with the bar. So I'm going to make the bracelet exactly to fit. By the time I fold back the sides of the actual bracelet then, that'll give me enough room for the clasp. So continue adding and adding your 6 beads, 3 at a time, continuing to grow your peyote strip. As you proceed to make your peyote strip longer and longer, it gets to the point where we need to put on the clasp. If you want to do a clasp that has loops to it, you want to make sure to get the same amount of loop spacage as is appropriate to the actual piece. From here, you're usually going to add a seed bead and sew on the clasp just like you would a button. If you want to use a button, a Potomac cup button, say, and attach to that, you can make a V that you could do a collection of beads, go into the button, back down the button, and I usually do the length of beads that is going to be long. So I had 3 beads on, 3 more beads after the button, and then sew into the opposite end. Give a tight pull, and then you would reinforce the end of the clasp here with some additional thread through the beads and through the button. What we're going to be doing is adding it to this bar clasp. The bar clasp is going to eventually look seamless. The peyote will fold over on itself, and we actually fold over the peyote and stitch it together. This is also the way that you would repair a peyote strip too if you needed to do a repair. You're basically, or doing a tube as well, you're basically going to attach the peyote from one portion of the peyote to another portion of the peyote. So I'm removing these beads that I used as an example just to show you how I would do the button. And I'm going to get ready to sew into the bar. Taking my thread and needle at the very end, I'm going to go through the bar and pull my peyote strip through the bar as well. Once I have the peyote strip through the bar, I'm going to fold the strip over on itself. These bar clasps work really well with Delicas and 11/0 and 15/0 seed beads. So you can have they come in all different colors and all different finishes. Once you have your peyote strip back through the bar clasp, like I said, I'm going to fold the peyote back upon itself. This is going to make a tube out of the peyote. What I'm going to do then is with my thread and needle coming out along the outer edge here, I'm going to catch on to one of the peyote rows further back. I'm catching on to the actual bead that is on the strip of the peyote, sewing through that from the outer edge here, back a couple rows into the peyote. From here, I'm going to go, just like if I was adding another bead, you can see the purple beads were added here. I'm going to sew up through the purple bead that's on the far side of that clasp. Going back down, I'm going to sew and basically zigzagging back, sew through that olive color of the 11/0 seed bead. That is going to be the next one in line. If I need to, I can get my pliers and kind of do a little wiggle to get the thread and everything through here. This is why I usually use the thinner thread as I'm working with my project. Once the thread goes through there and you have that seaming going on, again, I'm going to pick up on the orchid color that's on the end of the strip, going back to the green color that's in the row that I'm following right there, that row of green, back to the orchid and out. From here, I'm going to do a nice tight pull. All of that black thread will disappear, and my peyote will almost kind of take over itself and be one consistent line or little tube there. From here, this thread that's hanging out on the end, I'm going to go into that peyote below it and sew through the pink bead on the opposite side here. And I'm just flipping over the piece then so I can see that thread coming out. From here, if you want to, you can reinforce by zigzagging back through those beads again and zigzagging back through and flipping it over. I'm zigzagging through the peyote stitch on the opposite side. Whenever I am going through the peyote stitch or reinforcing the peyote stitch, I'm always going to make sure that my thread and needle follow along the line. So you never want to jump from one green bead to another green bead on the outer edge. You always want to go along the diagonal, and that will make sure that you don't see any additional thread that may be hanging out there. This is especially true when you're working with Delicas. You can really kind of get that exact pattern going on because of the cut of the Delicas. Once you have the clasp reinforced to your liking, which again I'm just sewing through it one more time, you're then going to knot off your thread. To knot off the thread, you're going to take it somewhere in the middle of the project and pick up what's called a bridge thread. A bridge thread is going to be one of the threads that you see going from one bead to another. I'm going to pick up the bridge thread directly underneath where my needle is. and sew so that my thread and needle are underneath that bridge thread. Bringing the needle and thread through, I'll make a loop. Then I'm going to take my thread back through that loop one time, pull a little bit more, take my thread through the loop a second time, and pull nice and tight and get rid of that. If your needle's still on, you can sew back into the project, or if you want to, you can burn the thread off or even glue at the very end of the knot here. If you have your needle and thread on, it's a good idea to sew back kind of along that zigzag, but you don't want to pull super tight. If you pull super tight and you do a lot of zigzag lines, you'll actually get a wave in your peyote. You can check that out if you want to. A pattern peyote video to check out would be the Wavy American Flag bracelet. That's a great peyote stitch bracelet that shows you how to follow the peyote and following a pattern and creating as well. Once you have the end here, I'm going to grab my thread zap, heat it up, get the rest of that thread off, and burn it down flush against the project. From here then I'll turn over, put my needle on the other side of my peyote strip, and attach it in the same form along this side of the bar. When I go in to start the other side of the clasp, I try to make it so that the top of the peyote strip is to the top. Even though it's pretty flawless and you don't see actually where the pattern stops or starts, it still does have a tiny bit of a bump on it until you work it out a little bit and wear it more. On the other side, especially for this bar clasp, or anytime you're using a push clasp and attaching to that and back through to the loops, or even a button, you want to make sure that your thread is going the correct way and that you're attaching your ends to the same end that they need to, so there's not a twist in your peyote strip. If I take this clasp apart and by accident I attach it so that the bars meet up, it's going to have a twist in the middle if I need to close it. So I want to make sure that they're going the correct way, that when you look at them, they're facing opposite directions as the bar lays flat. Again, I'm going to push those beads into the bar here and pull through a little bit. And then I'm going to fold that peyote strip back upon itself to connect it to the opposite side. Connecting to the opposite side again, I'm coming out a pink. So I'm going to go into a pink. I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4 rows back from the row that I'm coming out of. I sew through the pink, then through the green at the end. Through the pink, 4 rows back, here at the end. Come on out of there, sew through the green. Sew through the next pink in that same line. Sew on out. After I'm out that last pink then, I'll sew through the last green. Give a nice tight pull and again make that kind of seamless connection. From here I'll jump over to the next green bead and come back the peyote a little bit to reinforce. Again, kind of picking up all those beads. Once you reinforce, again, we're just going to knot off our peyote somewhere underneath with one of those bridge threads. Going underneath the thread, sewing under it, making a loop, sewing back through that loop once, back through that loop twice, giving a nice tight pull. And then since I still have the thread on this one, I'll continue to sew back through the project and get rid of my thread a little bit, following along a peyote line, kind of zigzagging right along here. Once I have it coming out somewhere towards the end, but not on the end, I'll grab my burner, extend that out, and burn that thread down. At this point then, my peyote strip and bracelet is complete, and I can wear it proudly knowing that I now know how to complete and do peyote stitch. Like I said, there's a lot of great videos that you can check out that I already have with the peyote stitch. The beginner peyote stitch previously, doing the chevron with the 8/0 seed beads, doing the crystal V video There's also a written pattern for the crystal V and the chevron. You can also check out the wavy American flag. And once you learn peyote, you can make the tubes, you can do some bezeling, you can do tubular, and really kind of go from there. So again, there's a lot to learn when it comes to peyote, but hopefully this video gave you a nice introduction to knowing exactly how to do peyote stitch. Again, if you need any of the materials to learn peyote or to do this fun peyote stitch bracelet, you can go back to the beginning of the video to that video date stamp where I have the materials listed underneath that show more button or explaining them in the beginning. You can also visit us at potomacbeads.com and shop from me there online. You can also stay connected with me by subscribing to this YouTube channel, and then you'll get regular updates when we do new videos and we have great stuff and content for you that we put out there. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest, as well as join our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making. It's a great interactive group that you can ask to become a member of, that has a wonderful collection of people that love to make jewelry, love the design, love the art, and are very helpful in offering inspiration as well as aid. As always, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and have fun going to town after you learn peyote stitch. The options are endless.